whether to disclose your childhood trauma is something that virtually every survivor struggles with, whether it is as a child or even into our adult lives. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And today I'm going to answer a question that somebody sent in about dealing with guilt when you don't disclose. Let's get into it. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you so much for joining me. So I want to be clear up front that this is not legal. I'm not coming at this at all from a legal perspective. And depending on where you are in the country or in the world, there may be some nuanced aspects to this that could vary. I am talking about this purely from a perspective of how you continue to heal when some of the issues around this can be present for you. So this is not at all talking about the legal aspect of it in any capacity. So it's important to understand that. I think it's also important to understand that what I'm going to share, it's my thoughts, it's my opinion, it is based on various experiences and stories that I have heard. So even with having the experience that I have, it is still an opinion. And I want to be clear that with that being an opinion, that there isn't an absolute. There's not a right or wrong. It's not black or white. And so what I'm going to share may feel different than what you think or what you've experienced or what somebody else might say. And part of the reason for that is because there's so much that goes into the decision. There's so much that is experienced as a result of disclosing or not disclosing. There are so many nuanced aspects of what it means for an individual person that there is no possible way that anybody can talk about this in a way that will encompass all of that. And so again, kind of as you hear me talk about some different things, ultimately the point is, as a survivor who is working on healing, what does it mean for you? Okay. So the question kind of was centering around, how do you deal with guilt of not disclosing all these years later when it happened to somebody else? So you're abused, you don't tell anybody, it ends up happening to somebody else. And well into your adult life, you still haven't disclosed it. And the guilt that may come up, and whether the guilt is for the potential of that person doing it to somebody else, or potentially the reality that that person has also abused somebody else before, during, or after the abuse that you experienced took place. And this really is something that I know I personally have struggled with this. And I would say that it's something that most people have some difficulty with. For some people, it's extreme. And for other people, it's just kind of this thing that comes up on occasion. But regardless of how present or prevalent it may be, it brings a lot of challenging feelings along with it. So first I want to say that particularly as a child, there are so many very, very real reasons why a child is not going to tell. So the fact that a child would tell, or the reality of a child telling, is, even at this point in time, still pretty small, especially as it's happening. Most of the cases in which we learn that a child is being abused while they're still a child It's not that the child just comes out and tells somebody. There's often some other sort of circumstance that happens in which somebody ends up finding out. And I don't know what the numbers are, but that is still the reality. But certainly if we go back a generation for sure, but maybe not even a full generation, the likelihood of a child telling for so many different reasons is very, very small. And there are a lot of very valid reasons for that. So if you're an adult who is struggling with the fact that you did not tell during that time, please really try to work on letting go of any guilt or responsibility that you're carrying. And that, I believe, is true. That I deeply desire for you. Whether that abuser that you know of never abused anybody else, and even if you know that they did. I'm going to try to stay focused on the point of this video. It really is important for your healing, for your well-being, and it's not going to help anybody else if you hold on to guilt and responsibility for the person that abused you, that abused somebody else. The only person responsible for that is the abuser. And one thing that I think is really important for you to keep in mind is that, unfortunately, the reality is that even if you had told as a child, the likelihood of you being believed, and that's a big one in all reality, especially depending on how old you are, the likelihood of you being believed is actually, unfortunately, relatively small. The likelihood of you being believed and then having that person held accountable, the perpetrator held accountable, is incredibly small. Absolutely incredibly small. And unfortunately, even if that person were held to account in some way, there's a good chance that they would still have an opportunity to abuse other children. And I'm sharing that, I'm saying that to you because I want you to understand the reality of the circumstance. It's very, very easy for us to get caught up in our sense of responsibility and believe as if we had told, then that person would have never had access to children again. They would have been held accountable and everybody would have been safe from that person. Unfortunately, that is not the reality. So it is really important that you are able to let go of the responsibility that you hold about that. And again, there are so many reasons that a child is not going to tell, and they're all valid. And unfortunately, many of them are based on the reality of what happens when somebody does disclose. If you are an adult and you are struggling with whether or not you tell people or tell somebody so that that person doesn't have access, that is a little bit harder because you're obviously not in that situation any longer. But I think it's important. Again, I am approaching this from the perspective of somebody who is working on healing, okay? I'm not an attorney. I'm not going to talk to you like an attorney, like a police officer or a friend or anybody else. This is purely about from the standpoint of healing. As an adult, nobody can tell you what you should or shouldn't do in this regard. Now, you might have a lot of people that do, but they have no right to tell you. Because, again, just like with a child, there are so many things that come into your reality of the circumstance that you're in and what it means for you to disclose. Now, in an ideal world, it never would have happened. But for argument's sake, let's say we're now in an ideal world. In an ideal world, all of us who have been abused as children would be able to come forward and name who that person was and be able to share what they did so that that person would no longer have any access to children. And something would happen to make sure that that person no longer had access. We don't live in an ideal world. Not only is there a lot within your own life that you need to consider, and in the circumstances and people around you, but there is still the reality that we live in which people are not believed. They are made to believe it is their fault. It's not taken seriously. Perpetrators are not held accountable. That's very obvious when we look at what is happening around us. People aren't believed. I think I might have already said that. But the reality that we are in at this point in time, and have certainly been throughout history, hopefully that changes at some point. The reality is that if every survivor came forward and shared their story and named their perpetrator, the likelihood of those perpetrators being held accountable and not being able to be around children is very, very small. That is the reality. And I don't have a number to give you because there is no actual, there may be some research in terms of people coming forward with like recent accounts, but when it comes to childhood trauma as an adult, there are time limits. And again, depending on state and country, it might be different, but literally that person may no longer legally be able to be held accountable. And if so, then they're still likely going to have access to children. So whether you choose to disclose, for whatever reason you choose to disclose, it is a very individual decision. And there are so many factors that go into whether somebody will feel safe enough to be able to do it, whether they will be able to feel emotionally capable of being able to do it. Because unfortunately, there are a lot of negative repercussions that can come from naming a perpetrator. Unfortunately, even from just disclosing that you were abused, but especially when you name a perpetrator and have the desire to have that person held responsible. And I don't think that any one of us has a right to say what somebody else should do. Doesn't mean that we can't have an opinion about it, but I think it's important that we all understand that each of us has our own experience, our own abuse experience, our own dynamics of the relationships that we have in our life, our own level of impact and where we are in the healing journey, the level of support that we have in our lives, the level of shame and self-worth that we have. There are so many things that go into it that none of us can say what is right for somebody else. Again, in an ideal world, we would all be able to come forward and name who that person is and have them held to account. It just isn't the reality of the world that we live in. And it's unfortunate. And I hope that that changes at some point. sooner rather than later. So there's a lot to consider. And if you are somebody who has struggled with feeling guilt around not disclosing, again, whether you just wonder if somebody's been abused or think that it's possible that somebody could have been abused, or even if you know that somebody was abused, it is important for you to be able to work through the guilt that you feel. And I've already talked about the reality of the circumstance. So just because you would have come forward doesn't mean that it would have changed anything. In fact, I've known people who have not necessarily come forward to authorities necessarily, but again, the likelihood of anything happening as a result of that is actually quite small. But certainly have come forward to like maybe a parent or somebody else's parent or something like that. And it's incredibly rare that that person is, again, both believed and then have something happen as a result of that. Oftentimes they're not believed. If they are believed, they're often blamed for what happened, or they are made to believe that they misunderstood the circumstance. They're gaslit into believing that this was a one-time thing. There's a lot that happens there, and it's so important for you to be able to recognize that the responsibility that you are holding, the guilt and maybe even the shame that you are holding about that, is based on a false idea, a lie, really, that if you had spoken up, everything would have been different. Or if you had said something to somebody else instead of the person that you said it to, that everything would be different. And the reality is, it probably would not be. So then what you do, what you then begin to focus on, is working on healing that part of you that has held responsibility for not only what happened to you, but what you believe is possible may have happened to somebody else. Being able to be compassionate with yourself around the things that you think you did wrong or should have done differently. Self-compassion is going to be probably the biggest thing that you can do to help release that sense of responsibility. And part of that self-compassion is being able to create understanding for what is happening with an individual when they can't disclose, when they feel like they can't. And again, it could be for so many different reasons. I know that for me, my stepfather was my first and primary abuser, and he was no longer in my life after the age of about, I don't even know now, but I don't know, 15 maybe, 13, 15, 13, I think. He was no longer in my life. And then there was a family kind of friend. He was no longer in my life. And then my brother. And I often thought about the other two people, my stepfather and the family friend. And the family friend actually had a daughter who I sometimes babysat. That's how it started. And I unfortunately feel very certain that he abused his daughter. I know he abused my friend. She was related to him. We were kind of being abused at the same time by him, but I'm fairly certain that he abused his daughter, and I never said anything. My friend and I did end up talking about it years later, but I never said anything. I never really said anything about my stepfather, and I have no idea where he went, or I know nothing about him. And my brother, I didn't say anything about my brother, and I had a niece, had a nephew as well. At that time, I would have thought it only happened to her, but in all reality, and God, I'm thinking about this right now. I believed, as most survivors do, when it happened, I believed that it was my fault. And we don't have to consciously think about it in this way. But if we believe it is our fault, in whatever way we believe that, then the idea of them doing it to somebody else doesn't necessarily even register as a real possibility. It may cross our mind, but it's gone pretty quickly. Because if we believe we're responsible, then we can't also believe, generally speaking, that it is likely going to happen to somebody else. Because if you think about different things that you said to yourself over the years, you don't blame other people, right, for their abuse. But if you're blaming yourself, then you're less likely to think that it's a very real possibility that they're doing it to somebody else, unless you already know that they are, and then you feel powerless anyway. So not consciously, I don't think, but I didn't think that he would have been doing it to anybody else. So it wasn't something that I contemplated and really thought about and came to a firm decision. It was just kind of an automatic decision because it was my fault that it happened. And again, I know that that's something that a lot of people believe without necessarily being consciously aware that you're believing that. And what I mean by consciously aware is you're not necessarily aware that you have that idea, but that idea is there and it's influencing what you believe, how you feel, what you do. And then as I got a little bit older, I felt like I couldn't say anything, because even once I realized that it wasn't my responsibility, and it wasn't my fault that he did it, I felt like I couldn't say anything because nobody would believe me. And while technically I could have still said something, if you're a survivor, you know exactly what I'm thinking here, or what I'm about to say, is that one of the biggest fears that we have is that we're not going to be believed. And there are a lot of reasons that we have that fear. But when you believe that you're not going to be believed, the risk is too great. The risk of somebody knowing is great. It's terrifying and it can keep people from disclosing. But the risk of telling and not being believed, that affects our system, our sense of safety in the world, our survival in an extreme way. It's as if we cannot survive that. So it's not a simple choice. We're not sitting around contemplating, do I or don't I? And each one is just a decision. It's not based on our literal survival. But that's what it feels like in our nervous system. There are so many reasons, valid reasons, that people do not disclose. And again, reminding yourself of the unfortunate reality that even if you did, the likelihood of that person being held accountable or no longer being able to be around children is actually quite small. And yes, let's work towards an ideal situation. Let's work towards an ideal world in which survivors as children, when it happens, can come forward. Let's work on an ideal world in which it never happens. But until survivors are believed, until perpetrators are held accountable, survivors will continue to struggle with the feeling, the very real experience happening internally of life or death. That is the reality. If you want to disclose, if you want to tell somebody that it happened, that is absolutely something that you can work on with a therapist, but I would definitely encourage you to work on it, to process the various pieces that are in play when you choose to disclose, especially for that purpose, because you have no control over the outcome. But you can work through some of that if that is what you feel that you want to do. And again, I wish that we all could feel that way. I was already in private practice. So I had been a therapist for a while at that point. I was already in private practice when my family found out about my brother. My niece already had a daughter. Oh, wait, maybe she didn't have a daughter, but I did have another niece. But that was the case before my family found out. And it wasn't something that I sat and contemplated a lot. I had thoughts about it, and I wanted to make sure that she was going to be safe. But I still had a part of me that thought he wouldn't do it to somebody else. But beyond that, probably the more life or death thing in terms of my nervous system was that I wouldn't be believed. And at that point, both of my parents and my grandparents had already died. And so I didn't have really much family left. And it's not an excuse. I wish I had said something much sooner. Much, much sooner. And while we can be responsible for not disclosing, the only person responsible for other people being abused is the perpetrator. And I think I have shared this story before, but it fits very specifically with this. So this is not about a childhood situation, but somebody who is assaulted as an adult. One of the things that we did as hospital advocates when I worked at the Rape Crisis Center, we would go to the hospital when somebody presented as being a survivor of just recently being sexually assaulted. And one of the things that we did was let them know what their rights were as a survivor. So that included the rape kit, it included whether or not they wanted to make a police report, their rights around that, different kinds of things. And one of the things law enforcement often did was push people to name their assailant or describe their assailant. And if they knew who it was, to name that person, which from a law enforcement perspective makes complete sense, right? They want to go out and catch the perpetrator. And thankfully, that's something they want to do. But again, there are many, many, many reasons, even when you know who the perpetrator is, that you may not want to say, especially when you're in the hospital, preparing for a rape kit or just completing a rape kit, waiting on all the medications that you have to take after being assaulted, figuring out what is next, having no clothes, having to go home in a sweatsuit that is given to you from the hospital. Like, there's a lot going on there. And so the reality is, a lot of people, especially when it's somebody that they know, they don't want to name who that person is. But the police are always going to be called, or at least in Illinois, at least at that time, the police are always going to be called when somebody comes into the hospital saying that they were sexually assaulted. The survivor has a right to not to not speak to the police. That is their right, but law enforcement is going to push that. And again, it makes sense that they would, right? But as an advocate, it's important that the client knows that they do not have to. They do not have to file a police report. They do not have to name a perpetrator. They do not have to move forward with that if they do not want to. Yet law enforcement will push them into it. And one particular day, I was there for somebody that had been sexually assaulted, and she knew the person. I don't think knew the person well, but she knew who it was. And the officer kept trying to push her into disclosing, and she didn't want to. And eventually the police officer threatened her with being arrested for something along the lines of like obstructing justice or something. I don't remember exactly, if she did not disclose. And so she threatened her with being arrested because I think she had an outstanding warrant for something minor. Threatened to arrest her because of that outstanding warrant, and then also told her that it would be her fault if it happened to somebody else. And the threat and that pushed me over the edge. And I was very clear and asked the client if she wanted to continue talking to the police officer. She did not. And so I told the police officer that she needed to leave. It did not go over well. But when a police officer, and I'm sharing this because when a police officer who should know what the law is and what the client rights are, when a police officer is basically shaming you, it is hard for us as individuals to not take on that level of responsibility. But the truth is that if that perpetrator went out and perpetrated again and again, it is not that person's fault for not disclosing. Again, in an ideal world, yes, she would feel completely safe in being able to do so. She would feel supported and encouraged, not shamed, not blamed. That isn't the reality that we live in. And if he went on to perpetrate against somebody else, the only person responsible would be him. And I know people are going to have potentially some strong feelings about this. And I get it. And I have days that I feel more strongly on one side than the other. But always, and probably because of the many stories that I've heard over the years, always, I'm also able to keep in mind the reality of the circumstance. And I think that as a survivor, if you are struggling with that, it's important for you to be able to hold on to that as well. The only person responsible is the perpetrator. Always, under every circumstance. And that includes what they did to you. The only person responsible for that is the person that abused you. I'd really like to hear from you, just what this kind of brought up for you. Do you have kind of a strong opinion? I know it's very easy and really natural for us to say, absolutely, you should tell. Even believing that you have a responsibility to tell. And again, I think that's natural. I think that's reasonable to have that initial thought. But when you take a step back and look at the reality of the circumstance, and if you are a survivor looking at your own experience, it's much easier to see that there's so much that goes into it, so much nuance and context, so many individual things that play a role in that. And the more healing you do, the less shame you feel, the less responsible you feel. And when you're in that place where you no longer feel shame and you no longer feel responsible, that is where you can feel more capacity And in some ways, the actual literal ability to be able to disclose if that is what you choose to do. But when you're holding that responsibility, when you're feeling shame about it, the likelihood of being able to disclose in a way that isn't going to set you back, so to speak, it's going to have a pretty significant impact on you, probably in a negative way. If you are not in a place yet where you feel fully, deeply grounded in trusting that the shame is not yours and it was not your fault. So share in the comments your thoughts, your experiences. And again, it's not black and white. And if you have an opinion, share it and just be respectful. Because I think it is helpful to hear different thoughts, approaches to what this is. And definitely people within the justice system are likely going to have a very strong opinion about you need to tell. Even people potentially in a medical field might be more likely to suggest that. But people who work with survivors are likely going to have a little bit of a different opinion, because we have the full experience with somebody. We understand the reality and the totality of all of these different aspects of what it means. I wish it was really black and white, but it can only be black and white when it's ideal world, when it is an ideal world, and we are far from that. Thanks so much for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.